Try that. There we go. Of course, there was no sound. What did you want? Perfection straight out the bat? No, so thank you very much. What I was saying, even though you couldn't hear me, was that I've really missed these. So thank you so much for joining. I can see that you're tuning in all over the world. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I haven't been able to do these for quite a long period of time, simply because I've been very, very busy working on lots of other projects. Those projects have seen me travelling a lot, and it got far too frequent that I simply wasn't here on a Monday night. Or if I was, I'd been away for lots of other parts of the week, and that meant it felt like a bit of a stretch to have to give up that one final night that I had at home to be able to do this. So that's the reason it was on hold. I definitely missed it, and there was always a plan to bring it back. So here we are for 2023. I want to say a big thank you to all of you, as I said, and I think we just get straight into it. I put something out earlier on Twitter, just posting about this evening's show and asking for any questions. I've got a few of those. I'll obviously take plenty of questions from the live chat here as well. So if you've got one, throw it in there now. And we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. But of course, the season is back underway. I'm sure we all watched it yesterday. May not have been the most exciting race that we've ever seen in the world. It was very, very dominant from Max Verstappen, but also from Red Bull. Very clear that they've got a superbly strong car, and you've got to give massive credit for that. I know that we all want to see a race and we want to see something closer, but you've got to give the guys and girls at Red Bull massive credit for what they've turned out. Yes, of course, they already had a very good car last year, so it was about tweaking that and evolving it rather than any major revamp that some of the other teams have had to do. But even so, they have improved on a car that was already the class of the field, and for that, you have to give massive credit. Let's see what you want to talk about. Right, here we go. I'm here for the dogs. Yeah, the dogs. So you may remember, those of you who tuned in last time we did this, which was probably 6 months ago, I used to go over to my house, which is the building site, or was a building site, and do the podcast over there. Well, now the house is finished, so we're living in the house. And now I'm sat here in my log cabin in the garden, which was where I was living first time around we did this. So I've now used this as a studio, and the house is the house, whereas before the studio was the house and the building site of the house was the studio. So that's why we're in here. But it's lovely to be back in a house and not in a garden shed. Right, so has Alonso finally got it right? The right team at the right time, says Maria Holland. Hello, Maria. I know you're a regular viewer. I recognise that name. I think so, yes, absolutely. Fernando Alonso, I might as well start there because he was probably the biggest story line of the weekend, wasn't he? Fernando Alonso has got it right. He has jumped to a team that is on the up. And if we're going to give credit to Red Bull and Max Verstappen, you've got to give massive credit to Aston Martin, because they have taken the biggest leap over the winter, and it's substantial. You know, it's rare that you get a giant leap forward from one season to the next in the limited amount of testing we have today, under the budget capped environment we operate in, and yet Aston Martin have done a remarkable job on that front. So you've got to give huge applause and credit to them. And yes, Fernando Alonso, probably in his last move in Formula One, you would have to imagine. He's 41 years old. You would imagine he's not going to be jumping around to many more teams, and maybe this is where he finally got it right. I'm not saying he's going to win the championship. I think we can pretty clearly say that, bar some horrible disaster for Max, I know it's early days and no one wants to hear it, but Max Verstappen has a car that's very clearly, I would say, from early signs, capable at least of winning a world championship, perhaps without too much challenge. So we'll see how that pans out. But Fernando Alonso has got a car that I think is a great car straight out the box, but also has room and scope for improvement still. This was a concept that they kind of pivoted last year, halfway through, didn't they? If you remember, they switched to that car that everybody called the Green Red Bull. It looks like a Red Bull. It's very much based on a Red Bull. And since then, many other teams have now done the same. So anyone who complained about that at the time or questioned it and said, look, they should be coming up with their own designs, the design that Red Bull have, or the philosophy at least that they have in terms of their aero spec, has been now followed by a large percentage of the grid. So Aston Martin were ahead of that curve. They were smart in doing so. It's probably saved them a decent amount of money, but it's also put them on a development path where they're ahead of many of their main rivals who might have only switched over the course of the winter. So smart thinking all round from the team based at Silverstone, and I'm really pleased for them. A lot of guys and girls there that have never really tasted big success, have never really had the chance to mix it consistently at the front end of the grid, and maybe they'll have that opportunity this time around. So I'm pleased for all of them. I'm also pleased for Fernando. Fernando was like a sort of spring chicken over the weekend, a new spring in his step, new lease of life. And I guess having success, having performance underneath you does that for you, no matter how old you are. So look, I'm really pleased for them. I thought it was great entertainment seeing Fernando fight his way back after a difficult start. And I think we're going to see those battles and that entertainment continue through the season. We will see the likes of Lewis and Mercedes, I'm sure, pegged back at different circuits. You'll see Ferrari become, a more solid competitor. But we're going to see Fernando in that mix, I have no doubt. And that should keep people interested as the season goes on. So yes, very pleased for Fernando. I think he has got it right. Someone's saying the sound is muffled. Sorry about that. I'm using exactly the same mic that I always did. I think it's plugged in right. I mean, this is me, so it could be plugged in the wrong slot for all I know, but there we go. Sorry about that. There's not a lot I can do about that one. Tom Blackett says, McLaren to get the wooden spoon this year? Let's talk about McLaren. It's a disastrous start, isn't it? It's a difficult start to the season, and I know because many of my friends and former colleagues, lots of them are still there, and I know how hard this has been for them. When you've got a car that's just not good enough, early on. I mean, they knew before they'd even got it out the wind tunnel, unfortunately, that you heard Zach Brown talking about missing targets. That's aerodynamic targets in terms of the percentage gain from last year. They missed that. They didn't hit the targets they set themselves. They knew that before a car had even hit the track. And then they went testing. Their worst fears were all confirmed. So long before they got to this race weekend, they knew it was going to be a struggle. That was going to be a difficult weekend. And so it proved. So I don't think they're going to get the wooden spoon, because what I do think is that they at least already have a plan. And there is stuff in the pipeline to try and fix some of this. So knowing that they'd missed their targets, knowing that they hadn't brought a car long before it hit the racetrack, knowing they didn't have a car that was as good as it should have been or could have been, they were at least able to address that some months ago. And that means that the development parts and the components they need are sort of some way down the pipeline now, and they will come to that car, they'll come to the team, perhaps ahead of others, like Mercedes, for example, who might have had a realisation hit this weekend that things were worse than they thought, and maybe they need to go back to the drawing board a little bit. So when you do things like that, you have a long lead time for some of the major components, whereas McLaren are just a little bit further ahead than that. Whether they transform the car or not, who knows? Only time will tell that. But at least they recognised that the development path they were on wasn't the one that was going to deliver any longer term success, and so they were able to change that pre-season. It's a difficult call to make. It's a tough one, and it's a hard one to explain to shareholders and to fans, to sponsors, that you're already kind of accepting that the first few races are going to be really tough. But if you've got a bigger picture in mind and a longer term picture in mind, it's got to be worth it. If you think there's gains to be had by changing things, even though some short-term pain might lead to sort of longer-term gain. That's my hope at McLaren. But it is tough for everybody there. They're struggling, and they struggled for a long time. There was these little sort of shoots of hope, weren't there, when they started to get close and they got that win in Monza. They had podiums and they were just getting there or thereabouts, and it's taken a turn in the wrong direction. So that's tough. That is tough. But fingers crossed they find their way back. Right. Excuse me. Right. Danny Rick will be laughing all the way to the bank. I want to talk about this, right? Danny Rick, that's got to be tough. Not because he's jumped to Red Bull and they're, of course, winning. So he's part of that Red Bull team. They're winning. They've got a stonking car. They may well have major success this year. That's good. If you're wearing a Red Bull shirt, that's good. Yeah, he's probably getting a decent salary out of that. There may be bonuses attached to him being part of that development work as well. But that's not what he wants. How hard can you imagine this year must be for Danny Ric? And you can say he's brought some of it on himself because he didn't perform over the last couple of years, but he's had to take a decision, again, maybe thinking longer term, to get back into his old team at Red Bull, but take a real back seat. And that's hard anyway, because what he wants to be doing is driving. But it's even harder when you're a Formula One driver because, you know, you're a bit of a narcissist typically. You like to be centre of attention. I think Daniel's one of those people. He likes to have the cameras pointing at him to some extent. He likes to be in the limelight and people talking about how good he is out on the racetrack. When he delivered great races and those amazing overtakes, we all spoke about him. And that's a nice feeling for anybody. But for a Formula One driver who's the sort of star of the show, that's the sort of thing they thrive off quite often, for many of them at least. And yet he's not going to get any of that this year. He's literally in the background. There's going to be a lot of attention on the rest of the team, i.e. Max Verstappen and Checo. And yet Daniel's going to be sort of lurking around in the background and probably feeling like a bit of a spare part. He shouldn't, because it's an important role and he will contribute through development work, I have no doubt. He'll be great from a marketing point of view. He'll do a great job in that sense, I'm sure. But he wants to be behind the wheel. And when they've got a car that good, capable of winning championships, already we know that, I think. He's going to be frustrated not to be driving it. Right. All right, the rule changes and approaches to the new regs is what has caused McLaren and Mercedes competitiveness. They really suited Red Bull's design from even before, says Matt Potter. The rule changes and approaches to the new regs are what's caused McLaren and Mercedes, I guess he means lack of competitiveness. They really suited Red Bull's design from even before. I'm not sure that's entirely clear. I suspect what you're saying is, I don't know if you're talking about the little regulation changes that have happened from last year or the big set of regs. I presume the big set of regs that came in last year. The regulations didn't particularly suit anybody. There was such a dramatic change in car design from 2021 to 2022. So it's not like these were a set of regs designed to suit somebody's existing car, because you threw that old car away at the end of 2021 and you literally started with a blank sheet of paper. I don't think you can blame the regulations for any one team either succeeding or not. I think you've got to put that blame at the feet of the teams that didn't manage to pull it off, and heap reward and praise on the teams that did. Red Bull did a wonderful job last year. McLaren struggled. Mercedes struggled because they didn't design a quick enough car. Ferrari struggled because they didn't operate their team in the right way, in the most efficient and effective way over the season. So the teams are the ones that have to be accountable for their performance or lack of it, but also when the accolades come rolling in, you've got to give credit where they're due. So I think we've got to take our hats off to people like Red Bull. They've managed to do it again, so I don't think we can really blame the rules on that. The rules are a set of regulations that everybody has to work towards and do the best job within those parameters, and they are the same for everybody, more or less. There's some slight tweaks this year, of course, with as the aero research restrictions come in, but I think you've got to say that Mercedes, McLaren and others failed, didn't do a good enough job. That's the harsh, brutal truth of it. And they're now on a mission and a journey, like a path to try and get back to the top. And they will, but it's still a young set of regs and it's going to take some time. Has the Ferrari concept already peaked, says Neil Williams. I don't think necessarily, no. I mean, look, we've got a very clear outlier in the concept from Red Bull, and that's not just about the concept, by the way. That's a combination of, they've got a very strong engine that seems reliable. They have got a wonderful team, brilliant driver, particularly in Max, but I think Checo as well to some extent. And the car has, maximised everything from tyre deg to downforce to efficiency to power. They kind of got it all right. And that's the holy grail in Formula One terms. That's what everyone's trying to do. Ferrari actually got really close to that, I think, last year. There were many occasions when Ferrari, I think, had the best car last year. But they messed it up on so many other occasions through strategic decisions, through operational decisions that went wrong, through making mistakes. And you can't do that at that high level. It's the simple truth. You can't afford to make mistakes. You get punished. I'm not saying Ferrari had a car that could have won the championship. Perhaps it could, or at least it could have been in the fight for a lot longer than it was. But I think they were outdeveloped and out-operated by a better team last year. But I don't think their car has necessarily peaked. I do think that is a decent car. They have made some gains this year, they say, in terms of wind tunnel, in terms of power output, drivability. We never really got to see that yesterday because they had an engine failure, and that is a very stark reality. They suffered with a reliability problem that cost them an immediate 25 points. And these are the kind of things that hampered them last year. They can't afford to do that. If Red Bull aren't doing that, then they are going to win this championship because those around them are still making mistakes. So, I don't think Ferrari's car concept has necessarily peaked. It's kind of impossible to tell because you don't know what development path they're on, and they will already have things in the pipeline that they think will improve it. But I think we need a slightly bigger sample set of data, if you like, than just one race. But there were times over the weekend when the Ferrari looked really quick. So maybe at other circuits they will be much, much closer. We'll see. Right. Neil says, thanks for answering my question. You're welcome, Neil. Thanks for asking it. Right. If Red Bull has more dominant of a season than Mercedes... Hang on. If Red Bull has more dominant of a season than Marc in 2016, would you consider the new regs a bust? If Red Bull has... I'm sorry, I can't work that out. That's Matthew Gibson. Sorry, mate. I don't know if there's a couple of typos that are confusing me, but if Red Bull has more dominant of a season than Marc in 2016, would you consider the new regs a bust? No, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to pass on that one. I don't quite get it. Sorry. Right, question for later, says Matt Potter. What the hell went on with Ocon yesterday? Let's do it now. I mean, it was almost comical, wasn't it? I almost felt like the stewards must have been sitting in their room, almost embarrassed themselves to have to give another penalty. But, each one of these penalties was, I guess, a slam dunk. You can't really argue against any of them. It was one of those where it just spiralled out of control, and when things are going badly, sometimes they go really badly. So it started with Esteban not being positioned correctly in his start line box on the grid. That got him a 5-second penalty, of course. I don't think he can argue with it. If you saw the off-board shot, it definitely looked weird. He broke the rules, so he gets a penalty. And then, of course, when they did the 5-second penalty, a member of the team, and this is what I don't know because I wasn't necessarily listening to radio, but what typically happens when you get those 5-second pit stop penalties is the team manager or the chief mechanic or somebody will have a stopwatch. They will be there waiting for the car to stop. They'll click the stopwatch. They will count that down over everybody's radio. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And only at that point can everybody burst into action and do their jobs. So I don't know whether the failure came from the person counting the numbers down, whether they weren't counting the numbers down, or whether somebody around the car jumped the gun before the numbers were called down to 0. So I don't know the details of it, but somebody started working on the car before the 5 seconds had elapsed. That meant the stewards had no choice but to give a 10-second penalty. And of course, then he got caught speeding in the pit lane. So the poor bloke went from bad to worse, and he must have gone home last night thinking, what on earth just happened? So that was it, really. I don't think anyone can argue about it. It was just one of those things where it all went wrong together. But so we'll have to put that one behind him. However, I've got to say his teammate, Pierre Gasly, at least showed some promise in that car. He had a sort of monumental drive through the field. It was a difficult qualifying because he had his lap time deleted on Saturday. there are some glimmers of hope for Alpine, in that there is some pace in that car, some race pace at least. And so look, again, a bigger sample set is needed really to get a much clearer picture of the outright pace of everybody on the grid. But I think there's something to grasp onto at Alpine, even if the result, certainly on Esteban's side, wasn't one of those. What about Lance? That was a great drive, says Mr. Klotz. I agree. I think Lance Stroll, look, we don't know how bad his hands were. Only he knows that, how much it was affecting him. But to finish 6th in an Aston Martin after very little track time, missing all the testing, and look, we can probably attribute some of a lack of performance due to the pain he was suffering or the lack of mobility. It can only get better, surely, from there in terms of his mobility and his physicality. But he drove a great race. I thought he did a great weekend, in fact. Showed great determination to want to get back in the car, which, of course, I guess you would do. You know you've got a car that's really capable all of a sudden, and, of course, he wants to be in there. Overshadowed, of course, by his teammate, but you can explain, or he will perhaps explain, some of that away to his injuries. Of course, as the season goes on and those injuries completely heal, that's when he'll be fully judged against his teammate. And it's a tough judgment, that, isn't it? Being judged against a Fernando Alonso who's probably in the form of at least his last 10 years, if not his life. And but that's what he's going to be measured against. And I thought he accounted himself pretty well yesterday. So I think we've got to give credit where it's due. And I thought he did a decent job. Right, where are we? Alpine will come back for sure, says Tom Walker. I think I agree. Ocon did Maldonado in Hungary 2015. He did. I remember that. Yeah, he did. Albon was over the line, but kept his lap time. Don't know. I must admit, I haven't seen that one, so I can't really comment. But the stewards do look at it very closely, even more closely now than they have done in the past. They've got a little sensor loop around the track as well. So they've got a bit more technology to look at, as well as the multiple camera angles. So they are really looking closely at this. So it's a bit like football, isn't it, where the football goes over the line. But if you take that virtual top-down shot looking at the ball, there was that great example of it in the World Cup with Japan. Any football fans will remember. To anybody's eye, it looked like it was out. But when you get the all-important top-down shot, there was a part of the ball still covering the line, and that's all that matters. And it's the same with Formula One tyres. You've got to have part of your tyre over that line, and even though it might be difficult to see, or it might look out from various camera angles that we get, the stewards do get a lot more information to make those decisions. So I don't know the particular incident you're talking about, but I think we've got to put at least some trust and be grateful that they are now taking that more seriously. And all around the track is the idea. So the white line now delineates the edge of the track, as it always has done in the regulations, but they're now enforcing that, supposedly, all the way around the racetrack at every race circuit. So it's no longer going to be the case that they're only monitoring track limits at a certain place. It's going to be everywhere, and I think that's a good thing, how it should be. Can Ferrari fix their engine issues? I have absolutely no idea. I don't know, because I don't know what it was. They will only really be finding that out, I'm sure, today. It could be something really simple, or it could be something much more fundamental. But you'd have to say that if they've not experienced that before, so it's not a sort of recurring problem, you'd hope it's not something fundamental, something not baked into the design. And it may be that it's a faulty component in there. It may be that there was something to do with the operation over the weekend. It could be something, it could be anything, quite frankly. But because we haven't seen it before, i.e. they've been running that engine for quite a lot of miles and we haven't seen that, you'd hope it's not something really sort of fundamentally baked into its design, for their sake at least. Rex Priestley. Hello, Rex. It's my son, who probably should be in bed, Rex. I do remember this happening before. I just beg for an interesting season with lots of competition, and I think Bahrain was a good indicator to that, hopefully. Thanks, Rex. Thanks for the comment. Now go to bed. I think That's hilarious. Yeah, well, I think we're all hoping for a good, interesting season, Rex. I agree with you. My son Rex, by the way, just started karting. So we've been there tonight. He's having lessons, and we just started that process, which I appreciate. As everybody keeps telling me, what on earth have you done that for? That could be the most expensive decision you ever make in your life if he turns out to be good. Yeah, I know. We'll see how it goes. But he's having a lot of fun, and that is the main thing. Right. Carlos gap to Leclerc, an ongoing issue, or perhaps Leclerc engine being run at a higher mode. Okay, so was the gap between Carlos and Charles Leclerc just a genuine pace gap between the two drivers over the weekend, or was it perhaps that they were running Charles Leclerc's engine in higher power mode, and perhaps that was one of the reasons that his engine let go as Carlos's didn't? I'd be very surprised if they would start those kind of shenanigans at this stage, i.e. giving the two drivers different power modes. Don't forget you have to lock in your power mode now. You can't just keep tweaking it during the race at different stages or even during the weekend. You lock it in. The power mode you run in qualifying is the same one you have to run in the race. So I'd be very surprised if they have split the two in terms of what the two power outputs they were running. I don't think it was that different to what we've become used to seeing between Carlos and Charles Leclerc. I think Charles is more comfortable in that car, typically. He's had better results over time. He's definitely been the lead contender in a Ferrari for quite a long period of time now. Carlos has had his moments, and I firmly believe Carlos is a great driver. I've got a lot of time for him. I think he's got huge potential, but he hasn't yet found the way to consistently get the best out of that Ferrari, and I think the same happened this weekend. Again, first race, we will see at different tracks, different drivers coming into their own, because what happens is at different tracks the car characteristics change, or the car strengths and weaknesses are either accentuated at certain tracks or minimised at certain tracks, and that can really affect how that then ties in with a racing driver's style. So you do get an ebb and flow sometimes between teammates, where one driver one particular weekend will be much more comfortable all the way through, and it can be circuit specific. So you often see it, don't you? Certain drivers who've got a great record at certain circuits. So yeah, let's see what how that develops. But I think Carlos does kind of need to get on top of that, really, just to be to be matched up with Charles Leclerc. Otherwise, what will happen is that as the season goes on, and if they do find themselves to be competitive, he will be given the number 2 role in a situation where maybe Charles Leclerc has a hope at the championship, or maybe even it's just a case of going for race wins. It'll be Carlos who's going to be asked to back him up and do the sort of number 2 role, unless he can consistently get on pace with his teammates. So we'll keep an eye on that one. Right. I feel Marc are playing us, says Shaquille Clark. Well, if they're playing us, they're doing a good job of it if they're playing us. I can't quite understand why they would want to be so far off the pace just to play us. So I don't think so. I think Mercedes have got a problem. They've got a bigger problem than they thought they had. And it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because last year, when they decided to stick with that concept, and then again into this year, where they decided they were going to stick with that slightly different aero platform, the sort of weird side pods that makes them stand out from the rest. But that's not just about side pods, that's about the packaging of the power unit, it's about the floor, it's the whole aero package that kind of encompasses those side pods. They have seen enough in the CFD and in the wind tunnel very early in committing to that. They've seen enough to think it's got potential, like big potential. If they get it right, there's big potential, big performance to be had. Last year that was hidden because they had so much porpoising. They spent most of the year trying to deal with that. But I was kind of like, fair play to them for sticking with it, right? That was my thought, because they believed in it, and so they weren't going to be just swayed by what everyone else was doing. They believed they were on the right track. Having seen what they've turned up with this year, still following along a similar lines, it kind of feels like they're not on the right track, doesn't it? It feels like they have got some fundamental issues there, and it may well be they have to start looking at that concept and questioning whether that is indeed the right way to go. the numbers that they get from wind tunnel and CFD, if they are impressive, and you've got to assume they are because that's why they've gone down that route, how can they find those in the real world? Or is there something in the way between their virtual testing, their simulations and their wind tunnel, and what's happening on the racetrack in the real world? Is there some difference, some correlation, what's the word I'm looking for? Some big difference or disparity between the two. They haven't got correlation between what they're seeing on their computer screens and what they're seeing on the stopwatch. And it's not just the stopwatch, is it? It's about tyre deg, it's about drivability, it's inconsistent as a car in terms of what the drivers are feeling as well. So they've got problems. And the answer to that is a difficult one because, yes, they've got some stuff coming, but if they only now decide, and I don't know, I'm jumping ahead here, but if they only now decide that is the wrong concept and they need to complete 180 and pivot and go down a different path, like the Red Bull path as an example, as I said earlier, that's a huge lead time on getting those bits, but also it puts you so far on the back foot because whilst everyone else, like the Red Bulls of this world, have now been developing that for nearly a year and a half, they'd be starting from day one when those bits finally turned up. So it's a very difficult situation that Mercedes find themselves in. I feel sorry for them, and some of you may not have any sympathy after all the success they've had, but I do also believe they're still a great team, and I'm sure they will get to the bottom of this. I'm disappointed, I'm slightly surprised that it's taken this long, because I really had high hopes that they would come out the box much closer this year, and yet it doesn't seem to be any different in terms of that performance gap. So yeah, a real shame for Mercedes. They've got to find a way to improve on that, and they've got to do it quickly, and I'm not sure there is a quick fix. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Right. Newey always said that he designs his car for the real world, not the wind tunnel. Yeah, I mean, Newey's an old school designer. He's got it right. But look, wind tunnels, and especially CFD today, are so advanced. And the detail, the data, the learning that you can get from those is phenomenal. And look, if you get it right, and if you use it as a tool, it can be really powerful. So it's not that you shouldn't ever be using the wind tunnels or designing for a wind tunnel, all those things. You have to learn how to correlate what you see in a wind tunnel to what you see on the racetrack. Sometimes there's an offset, but you factor that in. You learn what that offset is very early on in testing. That's one of the jobs they go through in testing. And if you do find there's a consistent offset, probably just a small amount, you factor that into your numbers. So you just work with it, and you understand that if you get this number in the wind tunnel, it'll translate as this number on the real racetrack, and that's part of the process. But I just think it's worse than that. I think they are, really struggling to figure out how to overcome their problems at Mercedes. And as I said earlier, that's not a quick fix. Hi Mark, if you were the big boss at Ferrari and could headhunt 3 members of other team staff, who would it be? Max Verstappen? I don't know. That's a really difficult question, and it's rarely about just plucking a person from one team and putting them into another. Look, even with drivers, that doesn't always work. How good did we all, and I still believe this, but how good do we think Daniel Ricciardo is? When he was at Red Bull, we had him down as one of the best drivers out there. Literally, I think nobody would disagree with that. He was in the top table of Formula One drivers then. Look what's happened since. We picked him up, put him into another team, and it was pretty disastrous, really. So it doesn't always just work. And my point is, that's the same when you take somebody like an Adrian Newey and you put him somewhere else. I'm almost certain if you picked Adrian Newey out of Red Bull today and put him at Ferrari, he wouldn't last 5 minutes. I genuinely think that, because Red Bull has almost been built around Adrian. When Adrian was tempted to go to Red Bull from us at McLaren when I was there, when that happened, he was sold the dream of building a department around him, building a team around him, having the freedom and flexibility that he wanted to operate his personal life alongside his professional life. The freedom to go and design road cars or whatever else he wanted. And he's been given that freedom at Red Bull. So it's an environment that works for him. At Ferrari, it's a very different environment. So you can't just pluck somebody, put them into a different shirt and expect the results they were getting when they were at the last team. So I think it's a difficult question. I think Fred Vasseur at Ferrari, I would say I was pleased with that appointment. I think he's exactly what they need. It's going to take him a bit of time because I do have some insight into Ferrari. I know some people that until quite recently were working there. A number of people over the years that have worked in there. And I also know that it's a very difficult, quite specific culture. I kind of want to say Italian, and I don't mean that in any disparaging way. But Italian culture is quite different, let's say, to English culture. And so it's not as easy as just plucking people out of one place and putting them somewhere else and expecting it to work. So I think Ferrari need to change the culture. And I don't mean they need to be less Italian, that's not what I'm saying. But I think they need to change the environment in which people operate. I've mentioned this many times, both here and in my podcast, that Ferrari, I think, or last year especially, many of the problems that they had operationally and strategically, I don't believe were just down to a strategist. I believe they were down to the environment that strategist and everybody at Ferrari had to operate within. It feels like, and as I said, I have some insight into this, I feel like it's a pressure cooker, which we know it is. Ferrari's a sort of national team. But I also think the leadership of that team kind of got it wrong. And there was a culture of almost blame, looking for somebody to blame when something went wrong. It wasn't an open, free culture. It wasn't a culture that allowed people to freely make decisions without fear of that failure coming. And I think when that happens, and this is why I go and speak to companies all around the world today to talk about, when you have a culture like that, if you're the strategist at Ferrari, you're not very willing or comfortable in taking a risk, in making a call that might be not the obvious one. But that's exactly what you've got to do when you're a Formula One team strategist. You've got to look at your data and your numbers, and you get your experience and all the insights that you have around you, and you make a call. And it might not be the one that seems obvious on paper. But if you're terrified that the culture will close in on you if that decision doesn't work out, you're not going to make it. And I think that was a lot of what we saw last year. So for me, Ferrari is a cultural issue, at least in part. And I think Fred Vasseur is a really strong appointment in hopefully being able to address that. But there's no quick fix in changing a team culture anywhere. It's not an overnight thing. So he's got some work to do, I believe. But I believe he'll do it. He doesn't pull his punches. So I think he's a good man for the job. And he will gradually, over time, as the culture changes. And what happens, of course, as the culture changes, you start to attract the right people. You start to attract people that you want in your team. So it's not just a case of bringing somebody in by throwing a bucket full of money at them. They've got to want to come there. And that's always the way it works best. When you've got an environment that people feel, they've got a desire to be in, that's when you, get the best out of them and you get the best people turning up on your doorstep. So that's what Ferrari need to get towards, I think, over time. Can we talk about Pierre Gasly, says William Harris, stayed under the radar and achieved P9 from P20? Yeah, touched on him earlier on, didn't we? But he did do a really good job. I think that was a really solid job to get it into the points. And if they can get a clean weekend, which is definitely not what they had this weekend, there is potential. As I said, I think that car has potential. And I think Gasly, great driver. I think he's got a bit to prove as he's now broken free from the Red Bull camp, and I think he's got a lot of potential together with the car to have some good results. Right. Taking your point on CFD and wind tunnel data not migrating to the real world, especially for Mercedes, would you agree that 3 days of pre-season testing is just not enough? No, I don't agree on that basis. I'm not saying that actually CFD and wind tunnel correlation is normally very accurate. Today it's very, very accurate. You'll run your first test with a real car. You may get a couple of tiny half percentage points here or there. You might get something that's a tiny bit out, but actually most of the time it's spot on because these things have been calibrated to such a high level. So I don't think pre-season 3 days of pre-season testing for that reason is not enough. Is it enough in general? Well, it is enough, isn't it? Because as long as you give everyone the same, it's enough. I know that from a team perspective, they'd always love more, because the more track time you get, the more learning you get, the better prepared you are. But from a race perspective, the fact that we had some failures yesterday, the fact that some people were less comfortable than others, is partly because we didn't have a huge amount of testing, and that's probably a good thing. The downside is that, unfortunately, for many people, the guys that did get it absolutely right are the guys that walked away at the front. So if Max and Red Bull had been underprepared because of 3 days testing, I guess we'd be saying it's a wonderful thing, isn't it? It's closed the field up. But actually, they nailed it, and it was others that, to some extent, got it wrong. So I don't believe it's too few days. Of course, it saves a lot of money by not doing more testing. It does mean that they turn up underprepared, and whatever you give them, however many days you give the teams, they will maximise those days, and they'll adjust their programmes to get whatever they need to get done. So it's always a difficult call to say it's not enough, because it is. They will always make it enough. You can always do more, but as long as everyone gets the same, I think it's fine. Excuse me, I've got to blow my nose again. I've got a terrible cold. Right. Will the FIA make further regulation changes to stop Red Bull dominance as it was done to Marc in the hybrid era? Well, I actually think that the field will close up. Don't forget, we're very early on in this set of regulations. It's just the second year. We're just over 12 months into a sweeping set of regs. Red Bull have done a remarkable job, but others will catch up. It is going to take them time. I think I was talking to somebody about this today. I had a great day at Silverstone today, running around a racetrack in a Porsche, driving clients around. It's great fun. But we were talking motorsport all day. We were saying that one of the problems, in fact, it was David Brabham I was talking to today about this. He said one of the problems that Formula One has got is that under this cost-capped environment now that's so strict, if you've got a problem like Mercedes have, if you turn up at the first race with a car that's a bit of a dud, you don't have the scope to go and change it massively. It puts you under huge financial pressure. When I was still at McLaren, back in the early days, certainly in the early 2000s, when money just wasn't an object, you had as much of it as you wanted from your sponsor, as much as you needed. If you ran out, you go and ask for some more. If you're in a championship fight, which we did on many occasions, and they just turn over more money because they wanted to win the title. But if you turned up with a car that wasn't good enough, you'd have a new one designed and brought to, by the third race. You could have a completely new car. You could pound around testing and figure that out in the background in between races. So things were very different back then. But today, the cost cap is proving that it's got some limitations, because we want to see close racing. We want to see the teams converging towards the front. But we don't want a season to be written off because somebody turned up with a car that wasn't good enough on day one, and they couldn't afford to transform that until halfway through the season, if at all. I know you can argue that they should have turned up with a better car, and of course they should. And that's exactly what Red Bull would argue if these regulations were changed at some point. Of course that's what they'd say. But I wonder if there's scope to perhaps in future regulations, I'm not saying we do it now for this season, of course, but I'm saying in future regs, I wonder if there's an opportunity where perhaps in a 3-year period, every team gets a sort of bonus 50 million that they can deploy in like an emergency fund, and they can only deploy that 50 mil once in a 3-year period. But it might just give them the opportunity that if they turn up with a situation like Mercedes, the championship's not over on day one, and it gives them scope to go in and make the adjustments, the adaptations, spend their money and get themselves back on track, because ultimately the show benefits from that. We all want close racing. We'd have it, or we'd have a better chance of getting it if we gave that opportunity. In fact, let me know what you think of that. That's a little idea that was thrown around today, but I do think we're starting to see a potential problem on the horizon, that if nobody, if the closest rivals are a long way away and they can't really afford to make the real big changes they need to catch up, that's perhaps detrimental to the sport, isn't it? Right, so hopefully the cost cap penalty will start kicking in towards the end of the season for Red Bull. Yes, that's I guess a glimmer of hope, but in reality, I think they're so far ahead. They kind of got that covered. They're going to start to see the pinch when it comes to development. This car, of course, was designed long before any aero resource restriction was put in place as a result of them breaching the cost cap last year. So they didn't see an impact of that in this car, but they've got a lot less wind tunnel and CFD time than everyone else because of of winning the championship. That's a regulation that came in previously that's designed to close up the field. One that I really celebrate, think it's a great idea. But also they've obviously got some restrictions because of that penalty. So that's going to affect development. How much can they spend over the course of the season? How much time can they spend in the aero department tweaking this car and making it faster? But the reality is they knew they had this coming ahead of this year, and so they've done as good a job as they can with what they have. They've got to be efficient about how they spend their time and money, and they're doing a wonderful job of it. I don't want to keep banging on about how good Red Bull are, but they are. And I'm always one for celebrating people that do things well and have success. This success isn't as a result of them breaching the cost cap by a small amount. For all those people that say it's easy to win when you cheat, I don't buy that at all. Yes, they went over the cost cap through technicalities. I'm not saying they didn't do anything wrong, because they clearly did. But I don't believe it was anything significant enough to massively give them a huge advantage over anyone else. And I also just believe that they did a great job anyway. They'd already done a great job the year before that, and they're in a good place. They've got a good team of people. It's working really well. We should give credit for that. Right. If I was Toto, I would just redesign the car, take the penalties, and just deal with it. Even if no points are given, you'll be in the game. The problem with doing that is the penalties will be further reaching. So the penalties will come for next season. And so you might get back in the game. You might find yourself a car that's more competitive, but you'll then be hampered with those penalties for long into the future. So I don't think that's the answer. I think they can redesign the car if that's the way they want to go, but they're going to have to be very efficient and careful about how they spend money, how they save money from other areas, if that's what they want to do. And look, they'll be having a full investigation as to whether they want to throw this concept away or continually tweak it. And I don't know the answer to that, but certainly the results we saw don't look too promising. So that's, I'm sure, the discussions they'll be having over at Brackley right now. Thoughts on a tyre blanket ban? Is it safe, says Tom Walker? Will it make for better racing or just an environmental decision? No, it's definitely safe, absolutely. It's no different to, you drive to the grip you have available. So you have to then just change the way you drive the car. So as you come out the pits, you are going to be on cold tyres. It's going to be like driving in the wet to some extent. You're going to have a lot less grip. If you're driving in the wet, you drive more carefully. You apply the throttle in a different way. You're going to have to put a lot more focus in warming those tyres up in the correct way on your outlap. As it adds a new element to Formula One. I don't think it's going to be unsafe. I think it's just going to be, a lot of people will complain about it. The first time we have an accident, it will all be thrown at that. But I mean, look, you work to the parameters you've got. You work to what you're given with. And look, these are Formula One drivers. They will find a way to warm their tyres up. And it's not going to be the end of the world. So give them no tyre warmers. It saves a huge amount of money in terms of freight. Yes, it saves a huge amount of energy in terms of electrically heating those tyres. Massive amounts, by the way. And that's also important. When Formula One is moving towards a more carbon neutral event, net zero by 2030, and that's real, they're doing that. These are the kind of things they have to start thinking about, as we all should be. So I don't think it's going to negatively impact the racing. It may even make the racing more entertaining in those opening laps. And as different people have different grip levels, whether they're on an out lap or further down the stint, that could make something quite spicy and entertaining. So let's see. Right, so we've got about 10 minutes left. Right, mark my words, Marc, new car at Silverstone. Yeah, could well be. I mean, look, if you start that process now, Silverstone's about the time when you could probably expect to have something dramatic, something big, like a real significant conceptual change. So you could well be right there. They should have built a better car, says KMS Boss 2010. I agree. That's absolutely right. That you can never... Look, I've been in the situation when you've built an amazing car, you've smashed it, you've got everything right, and you're really proud of yourselves, you're excited for the season, and people want to peg you back through regulation changes or penalties or whatever, means people used to try and do it in really weird and underhand ways back in the day. It's a little bit more sort of open and transparent today, but it's frustrating when you've done a brilliant job. You know, Mercedes would have felt that to some extent in the past. Red Bull will have felt it as regulation changes have gone against them, and that's the way it works. That is how it goes. But there's a balance to be had between creating a sport. Formula One are the commercial rights holders of this sport. A sport that's massively valuable, that's growing still at an incredible rate. That's all to be celebrated. But at the heart of all that growth, it's not Netflix, it's not Drive to Survive. At the heart of all that growth has to be a good core product. It's got to be a core product that once you've stumbled across F1 by watching Drive to Survive, you flick on a Sunday and you watch the race, and it should be entertaining enough to keep you there, to turn you into a fan. That's the job of the commercial rights holder, i.e. Formula One. And so there's a balance to be had between giving a good, fair, consistent sporting competition and balancing that with creating a product that's entertaining. And that's always been the job of Formula One. It's always been a difficult thing. In the past, they've been really quite blunt about it and crude in some of the ways they've gone about doing that. But I think it's, as long as it's not done in too blunt a way, not too drastic in terms of the changes, and if they're given the right amount of notice, then every team has the same opportunity to exploit those changes. So the teams that have done a great job should be celebrated for doing that and congratulated. Max Verstappen and Red Bull, if they go on to win most races this season, that's an incredible achievement. We should all be saying, congratulations, well done. I know how hard that is to do. So, that's not something we should ever be critical of, and people don't like monotonous winners in terms of an entertainment perspective, but that is something that is a wonderful achievement. So I get it. It's difficult from both sides, isn't it? We want entertaining racing, but we also want to see the very best doing their thing. The problem is when the very best are that good and the next best are a long way behind, it becomes less entertaining. Right. Aston Martin uses Mercedes wind tunnel. Do you think Mercedes have the Delta from when they used it so they can copy some good development data, as Aston Martin will be using it more? So Aston Martin do use the Mercedes wind tunnel. That's absolutely true. They also have obviously the same power unit, but they also have the same gearbox. They have a lot of the rear suspension. So the back end of the car, in many respects, is very similar. Obviously very different from an aero perspective, but mechanically very similar. So to answer your question, no, Mercedes cannot get any access to Aston Martin wind tunnel data. That is highly forbidden in the regulations. And I don't think that a team like Mercedes would be even willing to try and find that out. Believe me, I know what the consequences of a team stealing information from another team can be, and it's big. About $100 million big. So they wouldn't be trying that. But it is kind of embarrassing for Mercedes, given that Aston Martin are a kind of a customer team. It's kind of embarrassing that they've absolutely trounced all over the works team, having rented their wind tunnel and borrowed a few bits from the back end. So that is something that's going to hurt Mercedes. Interestingly, my Aston Martin stock today went up 15% this morning, just off the back of that win. So a struggling car company, Aston Martin, as they have been for the last couple of years. But as ever, Formula One, even if it's just in the temporary sense, turning around the fortunes of the car company that's behind it. I'm not saying it will turn around those fortunes, but in the short term, a spike in, I think it translated to something like an extra $300 million of value was placed on Aston Martin as a company today, as the stock market's opened, off the back of Fernando Alonso's performance this weekend. That's pretty staggering, isn't it? And a real sign that Formula One can be an influential player in the wider world. People are sitting up and taking notice of Formula One, and that's, I think, good for the sport. Are McLaren in trouble this season? Yes, we've definitely talked about that. Right, so Mercedes doesn't have a Red Bull aero specialist though. No, but as I said, Mercedes don't forget, Mercedes have had 8 years of utter dominance in this sport. They know what they're doing. They are very, very good. They're a great team of great people. They have incredible resource, great facilities. They've got everything they need to compete at the highest level. They've just got it wrong somewhere down the line with this particular car, but perhaps the concept. It's not they suddenly need to go and get people from Red Bull to find a way to win. They will just need to work through their problems. Something they've been very good at, but it's been a while since they've been this much on the back foot. So that will be interesting on how they respond and how quickly they can respond as well. What is the logic behind the strange design at Mercedes? It doesn't work well, and why would they stay with it? Well, that's, I guess, what we've been talking about earlier. The logic is they see that it offers a considerable amount of potential. They just haven't managed to unlock it yet. But they will now, I'm sure, be questioning whether that is accurate or not. Thoughts on James Vowles and Williams' start to the year? Yeah, good point. Williams, I thought, had a great day, didn't they? To get a point on the debut, that was great. But also, just the performance of that car, I thought was great. They're showing signs that they are able to mix it this year. Logan Sargent also, I thought, had a good debut. And that's a positive start for the team. James Vowles, only time will tell whether he turns out to be a good team principal or not. I suspect he will be, knowing him as I do, knowing the kind of person he is. Doesn't always work, taking a person from a role, very good though he was in his last role, it doesn't always work taking a person who's just progressed through the company and then putting them in a more senior role that wasn't the role they were very good at before. That happens in a lot of businesses all around the world that I go and see. It doesn't always work. However, he is, I think, the right kind of person, the right material to lead a team. He's calm, he's methodical, he is very sort of focused and deliberate about making decisions, doesn't make rash decisions, he doesn't panic. He's one of those people. And that is exactly who you want leading a Formula One team. So if he's given the right resource, given the right freedom, given the right time, he could well be a really key appointment for helping Williams get back towards something further up the grid. I don't want to put too much of a target on them, but they got off to a great start, and I think that's great. Right, what have we got? We've only got a minute left. Look, I'm going to say a big thank you for this last minute. A huge thank you to you all, first of all, for joining, because I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have too. It's been way too long. I am going to try and do this every Grand Prix weekend. You may have seen today that the new season of Wheeler Dealers was announced, coming back to your screens on the 20th of March. That will mean that goes on telly at 9 p.m. on a Monday. So I may have to change the time slot for a period, but we'll see. I'll let you know. If you haven't yet checked out my podcast, Pit Lane Life Lessons, please do so. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. But also thank you. If you are one of those listeners or subscribers to my podcast, I really appreciate you. I love doing it, and it's something that's growing now, which I'm really pleased to see. I'd love it to grow more and faster. So if you can help with that, please do. Share it around, tell your friends. But thank you so much. That's it, folks. We are back. Thank you for being back with me. I hope you all have a great week, and I will be back in 2 weeks' time after the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. to go all over again and talk about whatever comes up on that one. In the meantime, continue to fire in your questions. Just use the hashtag AskElvis at any point in the week about anything Formula One related, and I will do my best to try and answer them. Whether it's just personally on social, I will do my best. I will see you very, very soon. Have a wonderful week. Ta-da.